Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? There is definitely a lot going on in the world right now on all fronts: political, economical, spiritual, both good and bad. But what about the bad stuff? If God is so good and if God is all-powerful, why does He allow bad things to happen? Can something seemingly bad be used for a greater good purpose that we are unaware of? To find out, let's look at the life of Daniel in the Old Testament book of Daniel, specifically chapter 6. It recounts how Daniel was betrayed by his jealous colleagues who tricked the king into murdering Daniel. Here's what happened in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel and the lion's den. 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be throughout the whole kingdom, 2 and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. 3. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. 4. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. 5. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." 6. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." 7. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. 9. Therefore King Darius signed the document and injunction. Why did they plot against Daniel that way? The key is in verse 3, where it explains the blessing of God on Daniel, which resulted in King Darius desiring to promote him. Verse 3 says, "Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." This was the source of their jealousy. They envied Daniel because the king was going to promote him over them. God could have stopped them, but He didn't. He allowed their evil plot to be played out. Why? God never does anything haphazardly or randomly, so it had to be for a specific reason. But what was the reason? Let's go back a bit. The organizational structure of King Darius' kingdom consisted of King Darius on top, 3 rulers below him, and 120 provincial rulers called satraps below them, and hundreds of local authorities under them. Daniel was one of the 3 rulers directly below King Darius, which was already a great position of respect and authority. And it is important to note, not only was Daniel one of the 3 rulers directly below the king, which by itself was an impressive position of authority, but in addition to this he was one of the few, if not the only, Hebrew out of all of the 3 rulers under the king, the 120 satraps below them, and all the local authorities below them. Daniel might have been the single Hebrew ruler out of hundreds of pagan rulers in that pagan kingdom. He was most likely the only one out of all of them who worshipped the God of Israel. Because of all of this, Daniel stood out. It made him unique among his peers. However, unbeknownst to King Darius, his underlings were jealous that he favored Daniel and was going to promote him above all of them. Remember, King Darius was not aware of why they had him sign this new decree, and he could not foresee that it would end up with him being forced to kill Daniel. Even though the king loved Daniel, he could not make an exception to his ruling once he sealed it with his signet ring. Remember, these were Daniel's colleagues and contemporaries. He worked with them every day. But they were jealous and envious of him because God's favor was on him. But God allowed their plot to go forward anyway. Remember, the reason Daniel was thrown into the lion's den was because he disobeyed the decree of King Darius, which forbade anyone from praying at all to any god for 30 days. It was Daniel's colleagues that convinced the king to issue this decree. They first watched Daniel and tried to find something to accuse him of, but they couldn't. Here's what it says in verse 4 of Daniel chapter 6. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. 5. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So they succeed. The king signed the decree and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. But it didn't end up the way they thought it would. Daniel 6. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, no diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then, at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. They succeeded in getting Daniel thrown into the lions' den, but it was them that were eaten by the lions, not Daniel. They ended up being thrown into the trap they set for Daniel. This is part of the reason why God did not stop them. By allowing Daniel to get thrown in, and then miraculously saving him, God accomplished something even greater. Let's read. Daniel 6. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages, that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree, that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Here we see that not only did God miraculously save Daniel, but in addition to that God moved on King Darius, the heathen pagan king, to issue a new decree requiring everyone in his kingdom, which at the time covered almost the entire earth, to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel above all other gods. Keep in mind King Darius was the king of the Achaemenid Empire, also called the First Persian Empire. It was an ancient Iranian empire based in Western Asia founded by Cyrus the Great. Ranging at its greatest extent from the Balkans and Eastern Europe proper in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, it was larger than any previous empire in history, spanning 5.5 million square kilometers or 2.1 million square miles. They were pagans and worshipped many gods. So for King Darius to issue a nationwide decree requiring everyone to acknowledge and reverence the God of Daniel above all their other gods was a huge miracle. They would have been better off leaving Daniel alone. God used what they meant for evil and turned it into a blessing. All praise be to the Lord God in heaven. So in conclusion, God allowed this bad thing to happen for two reasons. First, God used it to spread his word across King Darius' entire kingdom, exalting God above all their pagan gods, and second, to expose and dispose of Daniel's enemies. What they meant for evil God used for good. What at first seemed like a bad thing turned out to be good. This is why God sometimes allows bad things to happen to good people.